This morning, we are pleased to be joined by Rabbi Julie Greenberg. Rabbi Julie serves Congregation Leyv Ha-Ir Heart of the city, often sharing space with us in the Ethical Society building. She is also the Director of Climate Justice and Jobs for POWER Interfaith. Rabbi Julie's talk today is titled, The Rise of Worldwide Anti-Semitism. Julie.
Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you all for this invitation. I have very fond feelings of this ethical society community. For one thing, my great-grandparents were founding members of Felix Adler's ethical society community way back at the beginning. And my grandmother attended the Fieldston School, the ethical society school in New York. So we go way back. And also this was the home of the congregation that I've served for 22 years. We've recently, sadly, left the space because we needed a more mobility access friendly space for the community. But great, great friendship and appreciation, and also huge regard for your leader. We're often in the justice trenches together. So I'm glad to be here today. Moving into our topic. The rise of anti-Semitism around the world is egregious, shocking, and painful. And I want to address a number of aspects about this very sad topic. First, a brief historic overview. Historically, anti-Semitism arises in unsettled times when various groups are insecure, under-resourced, and often purposely divided one from the other, such as people at the bottom of the economic ranking, people in the middle, people at the top, not working together. In Europe and in the United States and in the Middle East, there are very different contexts for how this plays out. But anti-Semitism does tend historically to happen when groups are insecure, under-resourced, and often purposely divided. In Christian Europe, anti-Semitism was deeply, deeply entrenched and connected to the Christian church's early history of trying to differentiate itself from its sibling. Christianity was literally birthed out of Judaism. And it was always that alliance between the Christian kings and the Christian church rulers manipulating their relationship with the Jewish community to protect the power of Christian kings and the church in Christian Europe. Jews were in the precarious middle for hundreds of years, all through the Middle Ages and even up into modern times, often very close to the most powerful. Jews did become, in many cases, the part of the elite, not the most powerful, but serving the elite and very close to the elite, which in that case were the kings and the nobility. Jews were useful to the most powerful. Because we had been banned from owning land, we actually became some of the early traders and capitalists, money lenders. People in the Christian church weren't allowed to lend money. So it was very useful to have a Jewish community that could lend money. So Jews were very close to power, but didn't have the top power. Jews were in the precarious middle because in times of trouble, such as a peasant uprising, when the top was being threatened, Jews were a really useful scapegoat and target to deflect that energy away from the people who really had the power. So it was a complicated history of Jews as a community having some prosperity, having some privilege, but also having a lot of vulnerability, all in the same mix. During the Muslim reign in Europe, there was actually way better treatment of the subjected Jewish community. The Jewish communities were always subject, not the ruling powers, but treated fairly well in, for instance, the Golden Age of Spain and many of the other Muslim communities. We all know where the vicious, deeply rooted history of anti-Semitism in Europe led. And many of you, I imagine, lived through the Holocaust years and the aftermath. In the United States, there was a different story. Between 1880 and 1924, masses of immigrants were coming into this country. The doors were open. And many Jews were leaving Europe to escape terrible, terrible persecution. And many of the ancestors of my community came during that 44-year period. And I imagine some people's ancestors in this room came to this country during that period, mostly from Eastern Europe. So we know from our own personal family tree stories, life was not easy in the United States for those early immigrants. It was not easy for any of those early ethnic immigrants in that wave from Irish, Italian, Polish, other Eastern European immigrants. We know that those ancestors lived in tenements and often worked very, very long days, like 16, 18-hour days with no labor protections. We know that for Jews, there were quotas on hiring, quotas on educational opportunity. Actually, MIT was started because Harvard rejected most Jewish students and teachers. So it was not at all easy for those early ancestors of many of us, but the United States already had its own scapegoat. The United States did not need the Jews as a group to be at the bottom of a hierarchy of persecution and privilege, because the United States already had the Black people. And after World War II, at a time of rising prosperity in the United States, Jews were slowly but surely allowed to become white. And as Jews became white, we gained enormous opportunity in an expanding global economy. Europe was destroyed, so United States was the dominant world power in those post-World War II years. And once Jews were inducted into white society, allowed to be white and to be seen as white, which is always a question of social categorization, we were able to join that enormous privilege of those decades and to thrive. My father's own story is nestled into that history. He was the son of Eastern European, kind of lower middle class immigrants. His parents came to this country as young people. They didn't speak the language. They didn't have a penny, and they worked their way up. And he grew up in an all Jewish environment in New York, not at all religious, just everybody was Jewish. It was a pretty traumatized community as people's families disappeared in the Holocaust. The whole family tree left behind in Europe annihilated from everybody in that community. And he never expected that life would work out very well. There was lots of loss and anxiety and trouble in that community, coming from where they came from and facing what they faced. But my father came of age in that just post-world welcome into mainstream society. And he was able to attend Columbia on an ROTC scholarship and to join the Navy and to see the world, and then to enter a career. He was a journalist, and he was a brilliant, creative man. He founded a field of journalism, which is now called the politics of science, like who gets appointed and where's the money going and all the kind of political intrigue around science, which was just emerging there. And so anyway, he was like a typical example. A lot of people he went to high school with followed the same story. Dan Shore, who was, you probably heard his voice for years on NPR and in other places, I think CBS first, NPR. A whole swath of people had that experience that he had, which is being the kids of Eastern European immigrants in New York whose parents worked their way up and launched the kids into lives at a time when the rest of the United States was welcoming these rising folks, never to the top places of power, the very top places. Jews mostly have not been the owners of media and corporations, despite the accusations, but of a very, very privileged. In general, every Jewish individual story is different, but as a group, the Jewish community became very, very privileged during those years as a group. The price that we paid as a community was assimilation. The idea was if you can be American and just be like everybody else, kind of Protestant Catholic Jew was the big name, the name of a famous book after World War II. There will be a lot of opportunity. So a lot of being Jewish fell by the wayside, like what it meant to actually practice Judaism or live a Jewish life. But there was also a lot of privilege and acceptance. Just briefly, I want to say that in the Middle East, there's a whole different context of Jew hatred that comes from a confusion about the difference between Jews and the state of Israel. Being against the policies of a nation does not make you anti-Semitic. Being an anti-Zionist does not make you anti-Semitic. And that's a whole different conversation, but I'm raising it very briefly here because these confusions also impact the left and many student populations in this country, where there's a conflation of the abusiveness of the Jewish state with Judaism and Jews. And this confusion does need to be addressed, and it needs to be corrected, because that is anti-Semitism, to conflate those two things. So that needs to be addressed and corrected, even as we protect the right of people to speak against the state of Israel. Now, we've seen that historic pattern of when times are precarious and insecure, anti-Semitism rises. That happened in Europe, that happened in this country historically. And for the last 50 years in this country, a number of trends have created a context of insecurity. We've all been reading about these analyses in the news. Globalization, the flight of jobs, even when people didn't actually lose a job, they could see jobs moving overseas. They could see that unions that protected them were being decimated. They could see that this precarious gig work economy was on the rise. People driving Ubers, people doing DoorDash, having no safety net at all. And we've seen that people are suffering. We see that there's tons of suicide, there's tons of opioid addiction, there's tons of, we also see what's happening in our inner cities. Well, I'm talking right now about the rest of the population in America that had been more privileged and stable, becoming more precarious and suffering. And so we see the expected pattern that happens in insecure times and unsettled times. Scapegoating rises, anti-Semitism rises. And especially in the white Christian nationalist world, there are easy tropes to lift up, some of them imported from Europe. We also have been reading about the polarized nature of media. The iPhone came along, and there's, this escalated dramatically as we become more, polarized and separated by different media communities, giving us different news. And all of that separation keeps us from joining together to get what we collectively actually need as human beings. And all of this creates a destabilized, insecure, psychoeconomic picture. And we can expect more scapegoating and targeting in times like these, and we are seeing it. That's the pattern of when we see anti-Semitism. Now, I want to talk for a minute about responses to anti-Semitism. One response that we see around the world and in this country is to lean into the security situation, building fortress-like synagogues with barbed wire and armed guards. When I traveled in Central America, I had to apply to visit a synagogue, send my passport in a week in advance, and I'd get there and there'd be incredible security, layer upon layer upon layer of security, including applying a week ahead of time with my passport to even visit. There's a downside to all that security. At Germantown Jewish Center, when this all started, a Black teenager who's a member of the synagogue forgot his door fob, and the police standing there wouldn't let him attend his confirmation class. And so we see how racism connects with the security assumptions and actually threatens the collective of people who belong in the Jewish community. Another response has been to build relationships of solidarity. I think I have time just to share a couple stories of building solidarity like this in Philadelphia. A few years ago, many of you probably remember, a pig's head was thrown into a mosque. And that morning, when the news broke, our multi-faith network around Philadelphia, organized by POWER Interfaith, gathered together. We put out an emergency call and we showed up at the mayor's office 1 hour later, standing together in all our regalia, our kippot, our shawls, our robes, our collars, everybody, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, ethical society, Hindu. And we had the full range of people. And we stood together and we said, this will not be a city of hate. A number of years later, when the Tree of Life murders happened at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, a call went out from non-Jewish clergy leaders, show up for Shabbat. I think many of you probably participated even in this. And on the first Shabbat after that horrendous event, the Jewish community is so shaken. My particular congregation didn't have a service that week, but we were showing up at other congregations. And when we showed up for that service on that Friday night, standing outside in front of the building with posters, it still brings tears to my eyes, were people with posters saying, you do not stand alone, we stand with you. And it was such a moment of care and connection, deeply meaningful. So all the Jewish communities around the world are really wrestling with what balance of security and community solidarity do we choose? There isn't any right, easy answer, and every Jewish community is trying to figure it out. You all probably know the famous Reverend Dr. Niemöller quote, first they came for the gypsies, but I was not a gypsy, so I did not show up. Then they came for I'm not going to read the whole quote right here, but when they came for me, there was no one left to stand up. I want to ask, who else would we include today in that famous reading? Because really all people need basically the same things. And when we ensure the well-being of all people, we see way less of these hate, targeting, anti-Semitism, or any other kind of scapegoating going on. Everyone needs safe homes, affordable energy and transportation, healthy food, access to good health and mental health, livelihood, education, and a stable earth. When we work for the common good, we are challenging anti-Semitism. When we stand with each other so that no one is in it alone, we are challenging anti-Semitism. When we get to know about the needs and values of people in different geographic areas of different races and classes, we are challenging anti-Semitism. When we create systems in education and policing and social supports that don't measure and rank the value of human beings, always making sure someone's at the bottom who's degraded and deprived of resources, but rather we value all life on the planet, even beyond humans, we are challenging anti-Semitism. In addressing anti-Semitism, we have to target a system that allows anyone anywhere to be targeted, whether they are Black, Jewish, gay, or it is the earth itself as lowest ranked and vulnerable. That's how we challenge anti-Semitism. The ethical society community has a multi-generational commitment to making a world that works for all. So I want to end with an affirmation and appreciation of your big understanding of the interconnectedness of all of these issues. And as we stand for that interconnectedness, I just want to really end with an action call, because we are organizing statewide a call-in day of action on Wednesday, which is the first day of the new governor's term. He will be inaugurated on Tuesday, Wednesday, January 18th. As you probably know, will be his first day in office. And we are calling in across the state to ask him to lift up an amazing budget entry that we won last year, $125 million in the state budget, big victory, for whole home repairs, a way for people to have safe homes, green jobs, and affordable energy. And we want to make sure that he renews this funding this year, that he mentions it in his budget address and that he puts it in his budget. He was a champion of it before, and now he is the governor. So we just want to make sure we have his back, and we're pushing on him to both thank him and also call him into action on whole home repairs this year. I hope if I share with Betsy the information about that, she can share it with the whole community, and everybody will join the call-in day for the governor on Wednesday. And thank you all so much for being here and for thinking about these things and working for a good world. Thank you.